I'm Tom Gilmore, and I'm Sheriff of Greene County, Alabama.
It's my job to protect the lives and property of the people here.
Sheriff, good to see you. I wish we could have gotten here sooner.
You are looking at one of the unique, unknown leaders of the civil rights movement.
If you cannot afford to hire a lawyer...
He was a Southern black sheriff in the 1970s.
Y'all been doing all right?
We ain't been had no trouble.
He was the first black sheriff in Greene County, Alabama. He was known as the sheriff without a gun. My name is David Hoffman, and I got the chance to make a film with Tom Gilmore, a short documentary film, back in 1974, sponsored by, you won't believe this, an oil company, Mobil Oil. They said to me, make 12 3-minute, which was incredibly long at that time, documentary films about people who are independent, who are great Americans but unknown Americans. So my team and I searched through thousands, calling local reporters, reading lots of articles, and we found 100. We interviewed them on the phone, and we got down to 12, and one of those 12 was Tom Gilmore. So I show up in Utah, Alabama, and there's Tom, this incredibly dignified sheriff with a beautiful humanity for his people, really touching, without a gun. Why no gun? He said to me, and he said to a reporter once before he died, that he didn't need a gun. He found that by diffusing the situation, by listening and talking and being reasonable, he could help stop crime, arrest the needed party, calm the situation down without a gun. And he never used the gun. It's quite amazing. How did Tom Gilmore become Tom Gilmore Sheriff? He's driving down the street and he hits a little bit of water and a cop pulls him over and the cop shoves him over the car and says, "You just dirtied my car. I want you to wash my car." And he makes Tom Gilmore, with a lot of roughness, wash his car. That's his first experience with cops. Then several months later, he's come into the district court house to help a woman who has been abused by the police, who's got a case against the police. And what do? They beat him up in the district courthouse. I mean, severely beat him. Beat him up. Nobody does anything. Nobody says anything. This is crazy, he says. So he runs for sheriff. Now, Greene County, Alabama, 80% black people, way below the poverty line. The average in America, 13% at that time. You're going to see this short film, which I'm very proud of, and the decency of Sheriff Tom Gilmore. And take a look at that scene where he's walking with his grandmother and she talks. The beauty and the honor of that woman really got me at that time. I think Tom died at 74 of dementia. I thank him for doing that film with me and giving me the opportunity to see something so unusual at that moment in history.
I'm Tom Gilmore, and I'm Sheriff of Greene County, Alabama.
It's my job to protect the lives and property of the people here.
Sheriff, good to see you. I wish we could have gotten here sooner.
I was one of the first blacks in Alabama to be elected sheriff, and I've tried to bring dignity to the job.
Sheriff Gilmore surprised a lot of us. I think he's done a good job myself.
He tries to do justice by everybody, and that's as good as what a sheriff's supposed to do, I think.
If you cannot afford to hire a lawyer, one will be appointed to represent. There isn't much violent crime here in Greene County, but every once in a while, I have to lock somebody up for a serious offense. I've never got used to the cruelty of the jail. Maybe I haven't been in the job long enough.
Do you wish to talk to us now? Many folk that I see get in trouble because nobody would step up and show them at the moment that there was another alternative at that particular time. Y'all been doing all right?
We ain't been had no trouble.
Okay. Hi, little lady. You all right?
People want a sheriff that they can truly call their sheriff, one that they can feel and touch and see often. To me, that's important, and I think to them that's important.
It's the only swinger we had when I was growing up.
You know, folk have helped me in my life, just when I needed it, and I get an opportunity to kind of pay my debts. Growing up here, It's filled with good times and bad times. My grandmother would try to keep a smile on our face more often than tears in our eyes.
I would sit down and would tell them the best I knew how to go through the world. And I would tell them how to treat people. And that just come up in them to be a good person.
We didn't have anything, and we still felt our worth. And I think when I go into places now and see people as down and poor and this kind of thing, I can encourage them to move along.
You to get the information, what's done.
I've learned that it's more in the man than it is in the land. You know, I've got my riches within my soul, and it's just kind of a precious thing. Nobody can take that away from it. Yeah, even if it takes my life, it's being passed on to other people, and it'll keep going. Right, Andrew? Okay.
Tom Gilmore brings unusual understanding and compassion to a job that is always tough and sometimes dangerous. We felt you would admire the way he goes about his work and his life, as we do.
I used to be a runner in high school and college, and in my late 30s, I began to jog. Early wave of joggers, one of the most foolish things I ever did. And I was jogging near my house in Washington. I was an assistant attorney general of the United States, best friend of the attorney general of the United States, and I was jogging near my house. And a police came by. Fortunately, I had my Justice Department credentials in my hip pocket. Boy! I kept on jogging. My hair was beginning to gray, and then I'm jogging along. Boy! I keep on jogging. Hey, you boy! Spotlight on me. Boy, you better stop! I figured I better stop. And so I stopped, and two white cops get out, slam me up against a wall, spread my legs, and then spray my legs. Hit me pretty hard between the legs, and it hurt very much. I kept saying, look in my back pocket, reach in my back pocket. Boy, you robbed a store. Boy this, boy that, boy. They pulled out this thing, and it was a nice leather thing that said I was a Justice Department official. Oh, they melted. Oh, you look just like, we had a call, you just like, it fits you too, sir, blah, 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 blah. Well, of course, I called the police chief the minute I got home, and those guys were suspended and disciplined. If I had had no credentials in my pocket, I would have been in jail that night. Middle class, 37-year-old father of 2 children, doing nothing more than jogging. And that's not the only time it happened to me. Well, if it would happen to me, imagine what would happen to a 17-year-old black kid in the inner city.
The man speaking is Roger Wilkins. I'm David Hoffman, and I filmed this interview with Roger back in 1989, and this 72-year-old man is telling me of his experiences growing up in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s. He had a really tough time. Although he came from a middle-class family, became a lawyer, actually won a Pulitzer Prize, working for the Washington Post as a journalist with Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, the famous Watergate investigation. So I'm interviewing Roger in 1989, and we really hit it off. He was ready to talk, and I was ready to ask. And I said to him, be yourself. Just let me know what you felt, what you saw, and think about it in terms of future generations. He had a daughter, Elizabeth, and he said, I'm going to talk like I'm talking to her grandchildren. So here we are in the present with all that's going on in the country right now, the racial animosity, stuff in the streets, the government, the desire to make things better. And I'm thinking of Roger. He died at 74 of dementia, and he was speaking to me at that time for the future. We're in the future. I hope you enjoy or find provocative what Roger had to say.
In the early 50s, America was a horribly segregated country. It was as if the whole South was a rotten fruit that everybody could smell. There were a couple of notorious lynchings in Mississippi. A black kid named Emmett Till whistled at a white woman. They killed him. A black guy named Mac Charles Parker, who was accused of having raped a white woman, taken out of jail, killed, thrown in the river. I think both those guys were thrown in the river. Blacks were routinely pulled out of cars and beaten up by state troopers all throughout the South. Black poverty was just horrible. It was being shown in magazines. And then the Supreme Court decided that it was unconstitutional for states to run segregated school systems. And little cute, clean, starched black kids began to show up on people's television screens, being walked to school by their parents and screamed at by white people. The contrast could not have been more stark. The white people who were screaming were, the caricature is the people, working class people, you know, not terribly clean, some of them obese, faces distorted with anger, screaming obscenities at 6, 7-year-old children. Well, television was new, everybody was glued to it. That was one. 2, the country had fought this fight for democracy. Blacks felt it, whites felt it, and blacks were restless. They just, sitting on the back of the bus, being relegated to the upper floor of a theater, and sometimes to only one row of a theater. Going to a gas station when your bladder was full and not knowing whether you'd be permitted to use the bathroom. Having white people be just as rude to you as they chose to be, giving you absolutely no respect. Not being able to try on clothes that you bought at stores. All of that stuff. And worse was going on. And Northerners knew it, and they had tried kind of to avoid it. But when blacks started taking their children to school, the North could no longer avoid the stinking, rotting fruit. And the South was represented by some of the most unattractive people in the Congress. Senator Theodore G. Bilbo of Mississippi was just an awful human being. And there were a lot of Southerners in the House who just spewed bile. And so the North couldn't see it anymore. And blacks began to get hope from the fact that the Supreme Court had finally said, and blacks interpreted this 54 decision to mean the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution include us. Just as we've always said, all God's children are equal. And so we started to move. And white people thought that's right, and a lot of white people joined in.
You sound like you're talking about sort of the continuation of the Civil War, the way you describe it, or it's like
segregation, and the legalized oppression of black people was a continuation by the white South of the Civil War. That's exactly what it was. It was taking out on black people their venom against the white Northerners, and saying, you may think that you took our way of life away from us, but you're wrong, and your foolish social theories are wrong too. So it was a continuation of the Civil War, there's no question about it.
I want to ask you about some very basic concepts as they were perceived then. Integration. What did integration mean?
Well, integration had another connotation that was, it was squeezed the same way communism squeezed economics out of us. You couldn't say that you wanted integration to be all mixed up because the white Southerners kept on saying, well, all I want to do is sleep with white women. They say, no, we don't want to sleep with white women. Keep your darn women. They're not that cute anyway. We don't want them. What we want is good educations for our children. And I think that integration for us meant freedom from oppression. I don't think that black people really thought of joining the country club or this or that. They thought, get rid of this humiliation. First of all, get some equal education for our children. That everybody knew. That was a goal. Get equal education because that's our future. But don't tell me I can't go to the bathroom anymore. Don't tell me I can't sit anywhere on the bus or in the theater. Don't tell me that. I don't, it's just too terrible. I don't think it was a positive thing. I just think it was get rid of all of this oppression. I mean, you cannot understand how horrible it was to have to contemplate a trip south. And the third thing was freedom from fear of being injured in the South. But a trip to the South for a Northerner was fraught with peril because you were worried that your car run out of gas and some person would be violent to you and you have no recourse to the law because the law was totally unfair. And then once you got to the town where you were going to be, if you usually, if you're wise, you had made arrangements to stay with friends because you couldn't stay at the local hotel. And there was often no public place to eat. Well, we want to be rid of all of that stuff. I think if I thought about it, I would have thought that white people's bad views of black people are based on ignorance. And when we get together, they will cease to be ignorant about us, and the scales will fall from their eyes, and they will begin to be decent. That's what I thought. I was pretty naive, but that's what I thought. I think that black people were always super Americans. We had to believe in America more than other people did in order to have any hope, in order to live, in order not to go crazy. We had to believe that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments meant something, and that the Declaration of Independence, though written by a slave owner, did mean the full scope of the words. So once we had the opportunity to make it work, we went full bore at it. And besides, it had this terrible itch of the humiliation in our daily lives that we wanted to get rid of. But we also had something else, and that was a very powerful faith in the decency of white people. I no longer have that faith, but we had it then. And that was, if we can only demonstrate to white people how rotten this system is, most of them will change, and the country will change very rapidly. I think that gave us our discipline, and that faith, both in the country and in the decency of white people. White people owned everything. They owned they owned all the payrolls, and they owned all the cops, and they owned all the criminal courts. And ownership of the country is a great enforcer. Black person get out of line, he's deemed crazy and he's dealt with. Sometimes he's killed, sometimes he's sued for, he's prosecuted for tax evasion. Sometimes he's fired. Black people knew, I mean, in earlier, of course, you got killed or whipped in slavery times. So black people knew that it was very dangerous to express anger to white people and to tell white people how they felt and how stupid they thought white people were. And so the old black comedian once said, "Boss asked me what the weather's like, I look in his face before I look outside." I mean, and that kind of summed up the universe, the emotional universe within which black people had to operate. So it wasn't until the 50s and the 60s gave black people a little elbow room in the society that we could begin to express what was really in us and express our true outrage at this horrendous wrong, continuing wrong that had been done to us over 360 years. Which makes Frederick Douglass all the more astonishing. He made a 4th of July oration in 1852 when there was still slavery. And he said, "What is your 4th of July? A hypocrisy and a mockery." Black guy saying it in 1852, unbelievable. If I said something in 67, when I was 35 years old, it had antecedents back in that segregated schoolhouse, you know. Had antecedents when people threw stones at me when I rode to school. Had antecedents when people called me nigger. Had antecedents when people spit great gobs of gooey, nasty spit on my bicycle seat. So that, and it probably had also immediate stimuli, but the passion that went into what I might have said in 67 had a depth that was as deep as my entire being. Ralph Ellison wrote a great American novel called The Invisible Man. One of the great indignities that black people suffered was being invisible. White people not seeing them, or as Ellison said, what you see is something on the fringe of me, or what you see is a figment of your imagination, but you refuse to see me. What those people were saying, okay, you're doing all this for the South. Now see me. Here I am, right in the middle of New York, right in the middle of Chicago. See me. Do something. I need a job. I need a better school. I need something. And this is awful. So what I saw, despite the destruction, I was pleased because the invisible ghetto dweller was becoming visible. America finally was being forced to confront the fact that the maimed and the wounded from oppression were in the inner cities, and something had to be done about their plight. People didn't talk about police-community relations, and there weren't not very many integrated police forces, and the ones that had them had blacks at the lower end of the totem pole. And blacks saw the police as occupying armies. And police were insensitive and thought that their job was to contain the niggers and whip heads. And many of the riots around the country were triggered by a incident. The one in Harlem was a cop shot a kid. The one in Detroit, cop shot a kid. One in Watts, cop shot a kid. Black power means to me, when I sit now in the 1989 and have my 60-year-old black child on my lap and her little short afro, and I nuzzle my face in her hair and I say, "Oh, I love your hair. It is so wonderful. And your brown skin is so pretty." That's a lot of what black power left for me. It was a rejection. It was a fundamental rejection of all those rotten lies that white people had told us all this time about us. That my wide nose and my thick lips and my kinky hair made me inferior. That there is no way that my 30-year-old daughter can be as beautiful as Michelle Pfeiffer. It's outrageous. But we believed it. We believed it because they had the culture. They had the power. They made the movie shows. And they put Rita Hayworth on the cover of Life magazine instead of Lena Horne or some other black woman who had blacker features than that. They were the ones who made us the buffoons and the studs and the mammies, you know. They were the ones who told us we were slow and couldn't talk right and all the rest of it. And the worst thing you can do to a human being is to make her or him believe he doesn't count, can't do anything. And of all the things that, all the offenses that were done to me and other people about which I get angry, that's the one that just drives me crazy. I mean, it's not abstract to me. I mean, when I say these things, of course I understand what it means for millions of other black people, but it's also me personally, it's my children personally, it's my defense of my children. And I am profoundly offended that the society still assaults all three of my children that way. Profoundly offended. It makes me so angry I don't know what to do. When you have something that is that explosive, of course, it is not going to be contained so that it doesn't hurt somebody. So it becomes not just black is beautiful. Black is beautiful, you honky. It becomes a weapon. And it did. The country I live in now, it doesn't bear any resemblance to the country I was born into. And black people are so much freer. Now there's still this horrid thing in the ghetto. And it's 30%, 33% of black people are still impoverished. So I'm not saying that it is nearly over. But we are so much freer of the feeling that every white person might do us damage or hurt us, and that we can't be free and expansive, or that we have to be ashamed of our color. Or, I mean, a lot of people were strong enough and clear enough all forever who said, look, the racial problem in America is not about defects in black people, it's about defects in white people. A lot of people really understood that in their gut. But not until the 60s did large masses of black people really begin to understand that and say, hey, I have a right to be a human being. I have a right to take a deep breath, you know? I do not have to be judged, and I don't have to care if I take a deep breath what this white man down here says about me. And, you know, I'll tell you something. In the years since then, I have had negative, stupid judgments made about me by white people. Some of them took bread out of my mouth, you know. Some of them made me less well known. And it never really hurt me, because I really have a sense that most white people are not competent to judge me, because they don't know where I've come from. They have no sense of it. They don't know what glories are in my achievements, or in the achievements of most black people I know. So, you know, I may get mad for a little while if a white person does me wrong. But by and large, I think, well, that's what you get for living among people who are kind of diminished, culturally disadvantaged, you know. But something else has happened that I find astonishing. I saw a junk TV show the other night. And on this junk show, it was a made-for-TV movie. The romantic leads were black, which is astonishing in itself. But even more astonishing was that it showed a black man and a white woman in bed together. Just briefly, but it was no question what it was. I mean, it was not, you know, and they didn't elaborate on the scene, but they were in bed and they were hugging and well, now, that denotes, you know, it's the tip edge of pushing at popular culture. I would never have thought that popular culture would have come that far. I mean, now it was one of the, I think it was probably the worst made-for-TV movie I have ever seen in my whole life. And I am not telling you that the ultimate aim of all of this stuff is popular culture that shows romantic sex between black men and white women. What I am saying is that with that as the symbol of the the hated thing. Miscegenation is the hated thing. For the culture I would never have thought the culture in the 20th century would ever, the for-profit culture would ever dare to show that. Now, I suspect that the negative reaction to that, it was so strong they'll never show it again for another 5 years. Nevertheless, they did. I guess the other thing that I wouldn't have thought, and it's the worst thing, nobody could have told me, as I watched the community action agencies in 1970 and all the ferment, that by 1989, almost half the black kids in the United States would be growing up in poverty. If you had told me in Watts in '65 when I was there, with every government there was, the city government and the county government and the state government and the U.S. government, all saying, we're going to fix Watts. Nobody could have told me that I'd have gone back there in the '88 campaign with Jackson and Watts would be worse. That all that stuff that people said that they were going to put in isn't there.
You mean worse? You're not
Worse. The drugs have their hands so deep in that community. And people said, they said, Jesse, don't come in. And Jesse, it's too dangerous for you to come in. But Jesse went in. And so, and he had a meeting with the kids' gangs in Watts. And there were kids there who were just strung out on drugs. There were kids there who had gold ropes on their necks and beepers. All of them victims of the drug business in one way or another. And they were saying it to Jesse as they would have said to no other human being on this earth, things that were in their heart. My mind, I know it's wrong, Reverend. I know it's wrong, Reverend. But I just had nothing else to do. Reverend, another guy said, I know it's wrong. People shouldn't be using these things, but Reverend, I got to sell them because I pay my rent for my mother and I pay my rent for my aunt. Well, you know, now partly that is rationalization. You know that, but you also know it's true. That they are engaging in the only economic opportunity, and others say, "Oh, I'm all right, Reverend. I'm gonna get it together tomorrow, Reverend." And you know, I mean, these kids are just done. The hideous thing about it, the hideous thing for me that was ripping my heart, was that all these people were born after 1965. They were all born after I was there and after we were going to do all that stuff. That I would never have expected to see, and that's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking.
All right, Roger, I promise you I'll give you a copy of this tape because someday your daughter is going to value